I saw her throw the suitcase into the lake. It was a small thing at first, a glint of leather against evening light, the hollow thunk as it hit water, the splash that swallowed every other sound on the porch. The old kitchen clock kept ticking behind me, indifferent. The heat of the October air hung thick. The screen door slammed as I ran. In the space between the car's back-end tires and the shoreline, time narrowed to one terrible, crystalline motion. Cynthia's arm, the arc of the suitcase. She didn't look at me. She never did. She twisted away and the car peeled off, gravel spitting like a warning. For a second, I couldn't tell what I had seen. My mind offered up trash, luggage, a careless late return. Then the surface of the lake answered with a slow sinking that looked too deliberate. The leather floated, tilted, and then the face of it dipped under mud and reeds. I thought of Lewis, how he used to fish at this small cove when the days were easier, and something cold welded itself into my stomach. I didn't think. My shoes went into mud, my skirt got wet. I was in the shallows before my body had caught up to my brain. I grabbed the handle and the suitcase stuck as if the bottom had been nailed to the earth. My hand slipped on the damp leather. I heaved and pulled and felt the world narrow to the rasp of a zipper still clinging to a little rusted tooth. The zipper fought back like a mouth. I jammed the edge of my key in and forced the teeth apart with a sound that, I still hear it sometimes, the small mechanical tearing that came before the sound that would change everything. It wasn't trash. There was a smell I hadn't expected, river mud, old leather, and beneath it a wet new smell that is only babies in hospitals. A tiny broken sound, a flaccid, indistinct noise that rose like a question toward the gray sky. I saw a fist, or what might have been a fist, curled as if around the tiniest promise. The skin was blue at the lips. The whole thing looked wrong for the world, a newborn shoved into earth and water as if it were refuse. I remember kneeling on cold stones and pressing my shirt to that child's chest, feeling the ribs lift and fall, feeling the baby breathe like a borrowed, scared thing. I had been a mother for 45 years, and still nothing teaches you that exact shape of panic. I remember saying, "Please, say something," and blowing warm air into a throat so small I could have covered it with the pad of my thumb. I cleared mud from its nose with shaking fingers, pinched a shoulder, rubbed the back along a column I could somehow find with muscle memory and prayer mixed together. The first sounds that answered were not the baby's, they were my own. Voice cracked, a string of syllables I must have thought were prayers. The baby coughed, and then coughed again, a fragile, wet sound. The skin brightened, not warm yet, but less purple, as if each breath was a small rescue. I called 911 with one trembling hand and held the child with the other, as if holding too tight would make it vanish. My mind flicked through 1,000 practicalities, towels, blankets, warmth, while a dull, hot surge of anger rooted in me like an iron stake. By the time the ambulance arrived, the sun had taken on that flat, late light that makes everything appear already gone. Paramedics took over with the competency of people who have seen the edge of life and learned how to hold it. They wrapped the baby in warmed blankets, attached tiny monitor leads like a crown too big for a head, and spoke to me in instructions that tried to be gentle. "Ma'am, step back," one said. I couldn't. I could only present a hand and the nameless, fierce covenant of a grandmother's clutch. At the curb, a young paramedic sat beside me and tried to make conversation that had the strength of a distraction. "You did good," she told me, and I think I laughed then, a sound that was more amputation than relief. She called the infant's color improving, and the word held like a brittle promise. The ride to the hospital was a blur of red and white lights and the wail of sirens that always sounds like an alarm for the soul. I felt every rough edge of those minutes, the jag of the gurney, the antiseptic smell at the ER's automatic doors, the whisper of the paramedics' gloves as they handed the baby over. Eloise, I would come to know her name as if it were a lifeline, met us in the emergency bay. She had a steady, unassuming presence, the kind that takes a room's panic and makes it a handleable thing. This one was in cold water, she said, eyes sweeping the baby's damp hair and the shallow rise of the chest. Hypothermia is likely. We need to warm. We need to check for aspiration. You did right by bringing him here fast. Words swelled in me that had nothing to do with medicine. Thank you, God. Help us, please. I remember squeezing the tiny hand once more before it disappeared into sterile white curtains. The baby was too small, too fragile for naming. There was a ribbon tied to one wrist, half submerged in muck, and I kept thinking of ribbons and of Lewis's grin when he likes something that was small and right. Hospital lights always alter a person. They make the world look less forgiving and more exact. I sat at the plastic chair in a corridor that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and worn nerves. Father Anthony from our parish found me there within the hour, his cassock carrying an unassertive scent of coffee and paper. He didn't speak much at first. He simply sat, folded his hands, and asked me what name I wanted to call the baby in my head. I couldn't answer. All I could do was tell him what I had done, how I had seen Cynthia throw the suitcase, how I had dragged it from the mud, how I had found this small, wasted life. His hand on my shoulder was heavy, the weight of someone who has prayed with people from birth through to death. "We will stay with you," he said softly, and that was enough for a while. There are moments in the blur after an emergency when the world tries to process events into forms it can understand, and the forms were coming at me fast. The police arrived. A uniformed officer with a notepad asked me for my statement, and I tried to give it as if my mouth were a radio transmitting coordinates. He wrote in a tidy, controlled hand, asking the same questions twice as if sameness could make truth more stable. What time? What did she wear? What direction did the car go? I felt a hand at the back of my neck, a hot spot of retained adrenaline. Detective Fatima Salazar introduced herself with a firmness that didn't need to be loud. She had the professional's quiet, observant eyes, everything in place. She listened longer than she spoke. She took my account with the accumulation of other notes. "Walk me through it exactly," she said once. I did. I told her about the sound, the splash, the motion of the zipper. I told her about the mud and the smell. When I reached the part about the blue of the baby's lips, I started to weep and couldn't stop for a while. The earliest hours were a strange mix of clinical routine and human desperation. Nurses returned in shifts like a procession, each with their own brand of efficiency. The baby was transferred to the NICU with its own glass world of warm air and humming machines. A technician used a little bulb syringe to clear the airway. They told me the word aspiration, and I learned its shape by clenching my teeth at the syllables. Eloise said that the baby had hope, but no promises. She said that in the softest voice she could find. The police questioning spread like a shadow. They asked about Cynthia's relationship with Lewis. I said what had been true. They had been married. There had been tensions. Who could say marriages didn't have their underbellies? But that wasn't my place to diagnose. I kept repeating the facts I knew. Cynthia had been there. She had left in the car. She had thrown the suitcase. Everything else was fog. Of course, the world always wants more than facts. Within a few hours, an officer who'd been taking photographs out by the shoreline approached me with a folded print. It was of Cynthia's car, taken from the road. I hadn't looked at it. I hadn't yet been able to let the image of the car's taillights leave my eyes. The photograph was small and grainy, and it made my stomach drop in a different way. "We had someone else in the area who took pictures," he said. "We're compiling all of them. We'll need you to look at some later." I nodded because anyone who has been questioned enough learns that nodding is a form of survival. But the seed of doubt planted by the existence of those photos began to gnaw. I knew I had seen what I'd seen. My memory of Cynthia's throwing of the suitcase was sharp as a stone. Still, the police would be careful. They had to be. While the NICU doors closed on the baby's breathing, the world outside kept making its own noises. A paper on the nurse's station told of visiting hours and consent forms. A woman in a cultivated suit introduced herself as Eileen from social services and sat with what I took to be the demeanor of someone who was used to asking delicate, intrusive questions with the efficiency of paperwork. "We have to follow protocol," she told me, in that direct voice of someone who has to keep parents honest to the system. "We will be performing an assessment." Assessment? The word sounded clinical and mild against the interior clamor. I had raised a son from the days when he smelled like baby powder and baby sun. I had cartons mended and tax forms filed and meals baked. I had kept medicine schedules and school play dates and late-night bandage changes. And now I sat opposite a woman whose job it was to register my life into boxes and check marks, asking about smoke detectors and where I stored cleaning supplies, and if my home would pass a foster inspection. I felt oddly raw, like someone who had been rounded up on the strength of a single rescue-born miracle and told to prove they were fit for the responsibility. "Do you have anyone who can stay with you?" she asked. "Is there someone who can help with transportation? We'll need references, medical clearance, a background check. We will need proof of immunizations, and if you own a firearm." Firearm? I shook my head because Lewis had loved his tools and his weekend projects, but our house had no guns. I thought of the little mitten-sized hand in my palm at the lake and felt something large and wild awaken inside me, a maternal ferocity I had thought time and age had smoothed away. That evening the hospital brought us tea in cups that went cold before we could finish them. News trickled in. The baby was stable, but doctors wanted more tests. The NICU night nurse left a small, folded, soaked light blue blanket tucked in a storage cubby for us. I picked at the frayed edge until Father Anthony put his hand over mine and said, "Leave it be. It's theirs now." There were moments of quiet that first night when the battered, practical parts of life tried to assert themselves. I called my sister and told her in half-sanitized sentences what had happened. She said her voice on the line was thin, like tissue. "I'll come," she said. "Bring me whatever you need." Sleep that night was a 2-hour fabric of dreams and waking panic. I dreamed of umbrellas and pianos and of Lewis laughing that filthy, delighted laugh when he found a moth in the porch light and let it go. The funeral had been only last year. I still found his toothbrush in a mug sometimes, forgotten by the ways of a household. I had not expected this, that the next major thing in my life would be tied to the thin breath of a newborn who had been thrown like trash. In the small hours, Detective Salazar returned with a different look. Her face had that professional stiffness that means she was carrying new information. She sat and explained, carefully calibrated, that the hospital would be conducting standard forensic tests on the baby and that they'd need to run DNA to establish a chain of custody and parentage if necessary. She said the words possible neglect and suspicious circumstances with a perfect equanimity. I felt every hair on my arm stand up, as if the universe had been changed into a place where suspicion was the new truth. "You did the right thing," she told me again, and there was an edge to her words that made me think they meant more than rescue. "We will need your statement for the record. You may be asked to provide further testimony." "Can I see my grandson?" I asked, and the word came out like a flint strike. Can I be with him? We will do what we can to facilitate visits. Right now, the priority is the baby's health. Later, in a lull between rounds, Eloise told me things I could understand without a medical degree. Babies that spend time in cold water are at risk of hypothermia and aspiration, she explained in the way of someone speaking to a person desperate for clarity. We warm them slowly and check lungs with imaging when they stabilize. Infection risk is a concern, but right now we're focusing on respiratory function and body temperature. Small babies compensate differently. Their little bodies are all work and not much buffer. This one was wrapped up, she said, and I thought of the neatness of packaging that had been used to hide a life. Whoever left him wanted to make sure he didn't get out, it seems. The hospital asked for my identification and my relation to the child. I felt the word relation like a board. I said grandmother and wrote my name when asked. I signed a release form to allow the hospital to provide basic updates to the police. I agreed because I wanted the hospital quiet to itself and the police to have their space to move. Signing the form was like signing a bargain I hadn't anticipated, my name on a line that tied me to the consequences of a crime. Outside the NICU, the sunlight shifted, and small things that usually meant nothing assumed a halo of significance. I thought of Lewis's toothbrush again and the way his fingers had been rough from work. I thought of the last days after his accident, the funeral that felt like a machine working at odd speed, and how Cynthia had moved through it with a face that sometimes seemed to break and sometimes not. Even in grief, people show facets. We are all mosaics of a dozen small things. I had seen a hardness in Cynthia that I had barely permitted myself to name. That hardness didn't equate guilt. I was not the justice system. My task that night and for days after narrowed into a singular, fierce need. Keep that baby alive, keep him away from harm, and do whatever the legal and medical world wanted to make sure the child had a chance. Before I slept in a cot in the waiting room, because sleep that first night was a selfish luxury I could not afford, I wrote a few things down in an old grocery list pad I found in my purse. Names that mattered: Lewis, Cynthia, Eloise, Detective Salazar, Father Anthony, the baby. I wrote blanket blue because names anchor memory. I wrote simply, I found him, I found him. In the mornings that follow rescues, the practicalities reassert themselves with a punishing insistence. There were forms to fill out at the admissions desk, a stream of legal-sounding instructions about identification and who could be granted visitation. One of the nurses told me softly that because the baby's circumstances were under police investigation, I might not be able to take him home even if he did fine medically. Social services would be involved. They had to make sure any child left in a family home would be safe. The word safe felt both obvious and like a locked gate. I was a grandmother with a bruised collarbone of fury and a newborn in the glass cell of the NICU across the hall. I felt the world tilt to one single axis: protect him. I felt an old private anger for the part of the world that would allow a child to be discarded. I thought of all the small acts of Lewis's kindness, how he would bring what he had to share, his love of small, useful things, and of the way, in the months after his death, Cynthia had come and gone in moods I couldn't map. But suspicion is not the same as proof. I chose, for now, to hold the facts and let the investigation carry itself. Detective Salazar kept her face like a closing door in the days that followed. She came by the hospital with careful steps and a notebook of her own. She took statements from witnesses: the neighbor who had been watering a garden and had seen the car, a jogger who remembered the vague shape of a figure, a cell phone clip from someone who had been filming geese and happened to catch a flash of movement. They were small things that, when strung together, might make a rope. Every time someone mentioned evidence, I felt a small, unnecessary preemptive pride, the part of me that had witnessed and acted, and also a fear that what I'd seen might be reinterpreted by cameras and time. The thought that photographs could contradict the hard, bright thing of my own eyes was a new and sharp pain. I had faith in my memory, but I had also learned that facts make their own slow paths through systems. I needed to be patient and unstoppable at once. The baby, whom I began to call in my mind the little one, was on monitors that beeped like a distant sea. I learned how to read the graphs, to know when a dip meant a problem and when it was normal for such a small body to vary. I sat with my knuckles white around my cup of hospital coffee that was always too weak, always too cold. I waited for news, for the officer, for a call from someone who would tell me the next step. One afternoon, Detective Salazar came with a man in a plain jacket who introduced himself as a coroner's liaison. He spoke carefully, the way you try not to break glass. "We're going to be looking into Lewis's death again," he said. "We have some preliminary notes that suggest the possibility of mechanical failure not consistent with a simple accident. We can't say more yet." The sentence landed like a stone. I felt my entire chest rearrange. Questions we all had whispered in the night, the odd placement of the accident, the small details that didn't add up, suddenly had permission to be turned over, examined. The man said preliminary a few times to steady the conversation. He said, "We will need your cooperation," and I nodded because that was the only honest choice I could imagine. Sometimes in the days that stretched after that first terrible night, I would close my eyes and see not the baby in the glass isolette, but Lewis sitting on the back stoop, fiddling with a loose screw, his face threaded with concentration and a smile that made his whole body tilt. Memory does its work like a remedy and a wound. It kept me human for the people who needed me to be, and it kept me tormented enough to act. Each night I stood by the NICU glass and watched the baby's chest rise in regular intervals, the way a small world keeps its fragile order. Each night some nurse would come and tell me feeding went well or slight temperature delay, warming protocol underway. Each night I would touch the glass, feel the cold press through to my fingers, and whisper nonsense prayers. "Please grow, please live, please let me be enough." It was in one of those hollowed hours, with hospital lights humming like vigilant insects and monitors making small, steadier songs, that Detective Salazar said to me quietly, "We need you to write down everything you remember in your own words, not just for us, but for yourself." So I started to write. I wrote the sound of the zipper and the feel of the soggy leather. I wrote about Lewis's hands. I wrote in stop-and-go lines about Cynthia's car disappearing down the lane. I wrote that I had found the baby and that I had carried him to warmth. I wrote that I would protect him as if my life depended on it, because for the moment it did. If you want to hear the whole story and see how it ends, please subscribe. The nurses smiled at the interruption of our private urgency with the quiet modern etiquette of the internet age, but then as sleepless time resumed, we went on. There was no pause in the world's demand for answers, and my days became organized around the tiny loops of the NICU and the slow bureaucratic thrum of police work. I lived in a liminal space, not yet the baby's guardian, but not merely a witness either. I had been given an accidental truth and told by the law to wait while the machine of justice warmed up. There would be more to come. Tests, interviews, pictures, inspections. There would be a shaking apart of the life we'd all tried to hold together. For now, the immediate was keep breathing, keep him warm, keep telling the truth as you know it. When I closed my eyes that night, the images that came were not of crime scenes or courtrooms. They were of small domestic details. Lewis's chipped mug on the counter that I still refused to throw away, a blue blanket with frayed edges, the sound of the lake when it lapped the shore where the suitcase had sunk. I thought of names I might give that child, of the promise of a future that would feel both stolen and holy. In the colding hours before dawn, Eloise found me in the corridor and pressed a paper cup of tea into my hands. "You should try to rest," she said. "We will get you updates." "I won't rest," I said, and meant it. My life had narrowed to a single bright requirement: to be ready. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of waiting rooms, forms, and the low hum of machines. Every morning began the same way: the pale ritual of arrival, a cup of hospital coffee too weak to be called coffee, and the small private voyage to the NICU where the little one lay under glass like a secret. Nurses who had names I learned slowly, Marta, Jamal, Denise, moved with the soft competence of people who know how to keep delicate things warm. Eloise became a fixture, popping in with calm updates and an ability to translate medical language into something my heart could sit with. "And he rested through the night," she would say, nodding like it was a measure of small miracles. "The warming protocol held. We drew blood for cultures. Lungs look clearer on repeat imaging. For now, he's stable." Those words became the measure of my days. I came to the NICU at odd hours, before dawn when the light was thin and forgiving, in the middle of the day when visitors clogged the lobby, and again at dusk when exhaustion threatened to pull my knees out from under me. Each visit was a negotiation with fear. I learned to read the monitor's slow up and down like a metronome of mercy. I learned to trace the baby's tiny fingers through clear plastic and marvel at the anatomical improbability of such a fierce will to live. Detective Salazar was with us in a way that felt both reassuring and intrusive. She would come by quietly, sometimes with her back turned to catch me off guard, sometimes with information that shifted the ground beneath my feet. The photographs she showed me were small things: grainy images from a passerby's camera, a cropped frame from a traffic camera, a supermarket surveillance snapshot that, when strung together, hummed with implication. One of them, taken from a distance across the road near the cove, showed a car with a light streak of motion. Another, oddly, seemed to suggest a different angle of entry to the road than I had first remembered. The investigators were careful to call these clues, not proof, and they asked me to look at them and tell them, honestly and without pressure, what I had seen. Honesty is an odd thing in those moments. Your brain wants to be helpful, to make things fit, but my memory returned to the arc of Cynthia's arm, to the metallic chunk of the zipper, to the way the leather sighed as mud gave way. I did not shrink from what I had witnessed. What I feared, quietly and like a thin ache behind the teeth, was that little bits of time could be read differently by cameras and by people who hadn't been there. Still, Detective Salazar listened, and I watched the way she held a pen like a thin anchor. Then came the call that split my little containment. The lab had completed a set of tests, and they needed to talk to me. Dr. Alan Mendes, the forensic genetics specialist, was not a man of many soft words. His hands moved as if they were still used to tweezers and microscopes. He explained the results with a blunt precision I both appreciated and feared. "We ran parentage testing," he said. "The baby's DNA matches your son Lewis with a probability consistent with parentage. In plain terms, this child is your grandson." The room tilted. Before Dr. Mendes said anything else, the sound of my own breathing filled the space between sentences. I remember my first thought being both unbearable and strangely simple. Lewis. I thought of his hands, calloused, earnest, his laugh when he'd caught a fish too small to brag about, the way he bent to life as if it were always worth the effort. The confirmation felt like admission and theft at once. On the one hand, it solved the most private, aching mystery of those first hours. This tiny life belonged to my family. On the other hand, the association dragged with it a heavier truth, the need to know what had happened to Louis, to understand the chain of events that connected his death to the tossing of a case into a lake. The police had already opened that line of inquiry. The coroner's review and a careful re-examination of Louis's accident site revealed details that did not read like an accident. Braking components, the pattern of wear on metallurgical parts. These are the things that do not carry drama so much as a bleak, scientific stubbornness. The word sabotage entered our lives not as a thriller headline, but as a cold, professional hypothesis. There were signs the brakes had been tampered with. The idea lodged like a splinter. Tampering suggested intent, and intent suggested motive. Detective Salazar and her team followed threads with the slow patience of people who know how to piece together human decisions. They asked about the will, about insurance, about who stood to gain if Louis died. That is how the private paperwork of grief suddenly bled into a criminal investigation. Investigators discovered a recent revision to Louis's estate planning, an amending document that favored Cynthia in a way that had not existed months earlier. There were bank records and messages that suggested a strain between what had been promised and what had been delivered. I felt the old private anger again, this time flavored with grief. I thought of Louis as a man who loved the measurement of things, the right wrench for the right bolt, the care of a porch swing screw. He had not been careless with his life. For someone to have taken that life deliberately for reasons as cold as a changed beneficiary felt like a betrayal so intimate it left me breathless. Meanwhile, social services did what social services must do. Aline arrived with a pad of forms and an efficiency honed like a tool. Her questions were practical and intrusive. Do I have a smoke detector in the hallway? Where would the baby sleep? Do I have the ability to transport him for appointments? She arranged visits and told me gently but firmly what would be needed for the agency to recommend temporary placement. It was humiliating in all the private ways. An older woman asked to prove the suitability of her home as if a rescue were a job interview. "You're asking me to show me my life," I told Aline once, and she looked at me with plain compassion. "We ask the same things of everyone," she answered. "We have to ensure the child's safety." There were medical clearances to get, psychological checklists to fill, reference letters to retrieve from neighbors and church members. I felt like a novice even though I had years of experience as a parent. There were required classes about newborn care and attachment, seminars about safe sleep, CPR refresher sessions that left my hands cramped from practicing compressions on plastic dummies that smelled faintly of disinfectant. I attended them all in a kind of ferocious apprenticeship, determined that nothing in a form or a certificate would keep Hector, my son's child, from being held by me. The church became a quiet support network. Father Anthony and parishioners brought casseroles that warmed the evenings when I forgot to eat. The women from choir took turns sitting with me, bringing thermoses of tea and small practical mercy in the form of clean linens folded with too much care. They came to the hospital and sat, sometimes in silence, sometimes singing, small hymns under breath that felt like a domestic spell against the dark. While I fought the forms, Detective Salazar and her team followed leads the way a gardener tends to a row of seeds, patiently, persistently. They spoke to Carlos Medina, a mechanic who had, according to records and his own admission later to investigators, worked on Lewis's truck in the weeks before the accident. Carlos was a man who smelled like oil and confession. He told investigators that pressure had come from somewhere he couldn't name at first, strangers, people who asked for things he thought were harmless favors. The accounts were messy at first, then tidier as evidence and coaxing aligned. Carlos eventually admitted to having loosened certain components at the request of someone who promised a payment. He said he had been told it was a prank, that it would allow someone to scare Lewis. He said he never intended for a life to be lost. Whether his words were truthful or a version of them, what mattered in court later was his signature admitting interference with vehicle components, one of the links that turned suspicion into prosecution. The investigation found more paper evidence, emails, a bank transfer that mapped to weeks before the accident, and the will change I mentioned earlier. None of that alone proved murder. The prosecution had to assemble a narrative, motive, means, and opportunity. The moment the DNA confirmed the baby's lineage, the narrative had a human center. This is where the story of inheritance and custody and anger condensed into something prosecutable, a child born to a man who was dead, a sudden modification to legal documents that favored a surviving spouse, physical evidence suggesting sabotage. As these threads tightened, social services made a decision. Temporary custody would be placed with me, conditional on my passing the necessary checks. It was both a relief and a fresh challenge. There was the simple bureaucracy of sign-ins and forms, and then there were tests of capacity my pride bristled at, fingerprinting, background checks, an evaluation of my physical ability to care for a baby. I was 68. That fact arrhythmically pulsed through every appointment. Would I have the strength to carry a newborn up the stairs? Could I manage sleepless nights if my body protested with aches and a breath that came sharp? The questions were more about capacity than love, and love, no matter how fierce, does not substitute for medical clearance. I bristled more than once in meetings, rebuked the bureaucratic language that made my devotion into a checklist. But there was a pragmatic part of me that met forms head-on. I took classes with other parents, some by circumstance, others by choice, whose lives had been re-knit in ways mine never had. We practiced swaddling and feeding. We learned that newborns sleep in cycles, and that those cycles do not honor adult needs. I learned to carry a car seat with practiced, careful handles, to lift with my knees, to keep my back steady. A social worker inspected my home, measured the distance from the crib to potential hazards, checked the functionality of the smoke detector, and nodded when she saw that we had a small first aid kit. I passed by margin and by determination. At night, when the world grew quiet and the legal machine ground slower but no less inexorable, I would sit with Hector in my lap. He slept like a small, perfect agreement between grief and hope. His skin, once blue from cold water, had developed a healthy flush. His fingers wrapped instinctively around mine, as if to make ownership of the moment absolute. I would watch his lashes flutter, and sometimes I would whisper to him things I had been saving for years, memories of Lewis, promises about his future, quiet pleas that he might be spared the betrayals of the adult world. Then the phone calls started. They were short at first, a message left sounding like static, a voice threaded with calm and threat. Cynthia's voice, when it did come through, had a brittle edge I recognized from the funeral and from prior visits, a thin steel that barely masked desperate pleading. "You don't understand," she said once on the line, and my blood turned cold. I need help. I need money. I'm not asking much." I listened as if by doing so I might understand where she was, where her desperation had come from. Detective Salazar asked me to record the calls. "We need to document everything," she said. "If she's contacting you and making demands, we have to have that on record." I agreed, feeling foolish for the wire's presence and fierce with the knowledge that this could be the key to resolving the threat. One evening in a hospital corridor, a phone held between my knees and the recorder in my palm, Cynthia's voice threaded through like ice. She told me plainly she wanted the money. She wanted what she felt she had been promised. She talked about arrangements, about exchanges. There was menace in the way she spoke the baby's name, as if the child were a bargaining chip. I remember pressing the phone harder to my ear and feeling my heart like a tight, desperate drum. Detective Salazar and her team moved into planning mode. They organized a sting. The idea was simple: create a scenario in which Cynthia would come to retrieve the child, or at least to negotiate, and have backup close by. We chose an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town for reasons that felt cinematic but were simply practical. It offered a neutral meeting place with clear lines of sight and an easy perimeter for officers to control. I will not pretend I was not afraid. The briefing with the officers left no room for drama. They put a wire on me and rehearsed cues, the police radio whispering near my collar like a small living thing. They placed undercover officers at points where exits could be blocked. They gave me a panic button. Detective Salazar's tone was flat with professionalism, but I heard a personal urgency underneath. "Keep your hands visible at all times," she told me. "If she raises a weapon, get down and push the button. We will be right there." We staged the appearance of exchange: an empty car seat in my front passenger seat, a thermal blanket folded like a prop. The warehouse was the kind of place that makes your own shadow seem larger than it should be. Rusted beams, old shipping pallets, a smell of oil and loss. I sat in the car with the baby in his carrier, watching the dimming light through grime-smeared glass. My limbs were leaden. My mouth felt like cotton. I watched the dashboard, the seatbelt latch, the small strip of peeling paint on the steering wheel, like a Morse code of an ordinary life. When Cynthia arrived, she moved in the predatory economy I had seen before, fast, efficient, like someone who practiced mercilessness. She walked with the same even gait she always had, the small set of her jaw that suggested she had practiced not feeling. I stepped out of the car, my recorder alive against my blouse, and greeted her with the face I hoped was neutral. She spoke quickly, her words a practiced ledger of claims. "You were supposed to make this easier," she hissed. "You said you would be reasonable." The voice meant business, and it had practice behind it. I tried to hold steady, to keep my expression as calm as if I were in a grocery line. At some point, she reached into her bag as if to produce cash or papers. The motion was tiny and practiced. Then there was a metallic flash. It was the clink of something real, a gun, before everything afterward was a blur of sound and pain. The gun exploded with the abrupt authority of a bell. I remember a high cracking sound that belonged to the world and not to me. My chest seized. I felt a hot, sharp pressure in my side. For a moment, the only sound I registered was the frantic, small noise of my own breath. The baby began to cry, an instant of sound so pure it cleaved through confusion. Officers I had not known I could trust moved as if gravity had been reset. One dove across the car hood, another tackled Cynthia and wrestled the weapon away. I remember the sensation of falling into someone else's arms, Detective Salazar's hands under my shoulders, and the bitter metallic taste that came with the shock. I could see, out of the edge of vision, the world compacting into movement, sirens, flashlights, uniformed officers barking into radio mics. Cynthia was handcuffed, yelling. I heard her voice above the chaos, small and feral. The ache in my side was intense, but not catastrophic. The paramedics would later tell me the bullet had grazed muscle tissue and lodged in clothing, but it was enough to send me briefly into a wash of dizziness and the clinical numbness of shock. They took Cynthia away. They took me to the ambulance. I was aware of Eloise's face hovering in my peripheral vision, a lighthouse of compassion, and of Father Anthony's hand that found mine in the back of the ambulance and held it as if to anchor a wayward boat. I watched officers huddle with phones and recorded statements. In the chaos that followed, the truth cooled into a slow legal furnace. We had a recorded call, a witness, and now a violent act committed in the context of a documented demand. The police listened to the wire, took the recording, and cataloged it as key evidence. In the days after the shooting, there was an outpouring of care that carried me through bandage changes and interviews. The wound, superficial against the scale of what might have been, required stitches and a week's rest. Yet the emotional scar felt deeper and took longer to settle. Cynthia's presence in a jail cell, hauled in handcuffs and quiet for once, had a strange, numbing finality. She made a statement in custody that the investigators recorded. Whether out of remorse or calculation, she provided fragments that fit with the larger fabric of the case. Accusations, admissions, and a version of the desperation that had driven her. The prosecution mounted their case with the sort of methodical clarity that had initially made me apprehensive and now felt like the right kind of justice. Carlos's admission, the brake tampering, the change to Lewis's will, the bank transfers, the recorded extortion attempt, and the shooting all were joined like beads on a string. At trial, they laid out motive and opportunity with an unsettling precision. Witnesses I had only known as professionals, mechanics, bank clerks, forensic analysts, testified with technical calm. The hardest testimony, without surprise, was mine. I testified about the night by the lake, about the zipper catching, and the way I had held a child who had barely taken a breath. I spoke about Lewis, the honest, clumsy, loving man who had worked with his hands, and about the dull, seamless presence of grief that had followed his death. I told the court about the phone calls, the recording, and the way Cynthia had arrived at the warehouse. In court, the word custody felt different. It was no longer some bureaucratic term, but the legal frame around a child's right to safety. The jury deliberated. I cannot explain the strange physical sensation of waiting for a verdict that tied together so many of the private parts of a life. Memories, funeral services, the thin scraps of paperwork that amount to identity. When the verdict was read, I felt the floor move beneath me. Cynthia was convicted on charges that included first-degree murder and attempted murder. Those words were legal and heavy. They closed a loop that had been a raw, unstitched circle since Lewis's accident. Justice, when it arrives, does not feel like healing. The conviction resolved legal questions, but did not return my son's life or repair all the damage. It did, though, shape the way custody could be resolved. With Cynthia incarcerated and the legal chain clear, the court granted me temporary custody of Hector while social services carried through with their assessments. Temporary became more stable as I completed the required modules and passed inspections. My age, once a suspicious data point, became a footnote, weighed against evidence of my capacity, my knowledge of the child, and the community testimony of my fitness. There were hearings to attend, more documents to produce, affidavits to file with trembling hands. I learned the convoluted intimacy of courtrooms, the smell of varnished wood, the soft rustle of lawyers' papers. The judge, a woman whose sternness had a kindness to it, listened to arguments about fitness and family, about the child's best interests and the role of the state. In the end, permanent custody was awarded to me, along with legal adoption once the necessary statutory language could be prepared. The adoption hearing was quiet and intensely personal. I remember the judge saying words that made my hands sweat. This court finds that daughter's legacy will be vested in the care of the petitioner. It was official. Hector became, legally, my child. Adoption changed the shape of everything. The paperwork was a kind of rebirth, birth certificate amended, names considered, signatures given not out of anguish, but with intention. I chose the name Hector because it felt steady and poetic the way Lewis's name had always been. We chose it together, in the small way two people can choose in the wake of grief, between hospital visits, under the watchful ministrations of friends and family. Father Anthony read a small blessing at the courthouse steps, nothing doctrinal and everything human, and I signed forms with a hand that shook not from fear, but because the weight of what I had promised was finally codified. Rebuilding life was a gradual, stubborn thing. There were infant appointments, vaccinations, weight checks, meetings with a pediatrician who was gentle but direct. I learned to carry a baby carrier on long walks, to nurse when medicine did not cure it, to navigate nights when the smallest noises could feel like alarms. Hector hit milestones in his own steady way, and each one was a small, undramatic victory. The first time he grasped a spoon, the wobble of his first steps, the way he laughed when I made a face at him from behind the couch. I also continued to lean on people who had been there from the start. Eloise visited as often as she could, bringing insights I had only later accepted as necessary. She taught me how to recognize early signs of ear infections and how to soothe a fevered child without panic. Father Anthony became less of a fixture of emergency response and more a regular, slow presence, weekly calls, a homely conversation about a child's place in a family. Detective Salazar came to Hector's first birthday party and posed in a photograph with a paper hat on her head, a rare break from the serious face the world had become accustomed to. Community members knit tiny hats, and women from the church baked a cake sweet with their collective intention. There were legal echoes that lingered. Cynthia's sentence was long. On the day the verdict was read, she sat expressionless, her hands folded as if in a posture of prayer she did not feel. Later, in interviews and deposition transcripts, pieces of her story emerged, arguments about money, a sense of betrayal, a despair that had metastasized into dangerous choices. I tried to hold compassion at arm's length, not to excuse what was done, but to remember that terrible acts grow out of complicated, wounded places. Prosecutors had done their part, the court had issued its sentence, a life had been remade under the heavy hand of the law. In the quieter months that followed, parenting filled my days with a kind that was both ordinary and miraculous. Hector learned to call me grandma in a way that was more precious than the syllables might suggest. He would braid my thin hair with small plastic bands, press crusts of peanut butter into shapes that resembled trophies, and demand more story until the lights were dim. He grew matter-of-factly, he outgrew his onesies, he began to carry a rocking horse arm-length like an oar. Grief, too, was a constant companion. I would find myself staring at the place on the porch where Lewis used to sit, imagining him setting down a mug. Sometimes I would tell Hector stories about his father, about how Lewis taught him to whistle with a blade of grass, or how he used to braid friendship bracelets that, in my memory, never tangled. These were small, necessary acts of honor. They were a way of keeping two truths at once, that Louis was gone and that he had been, and how he had shaped the child in my arms. There was also the slow work of healing in community. We started a small scholarship fund in Louis's name at the local high school. Nothing grand, but a way to keep a part of him alive, to support kids who loved to tinker. The parish community rallied, not with spectacle, but with steady hands. People who had once brought casseroles now brought time, an afternoon watching Hector so I could nap, a ride to the store when my knees ached, a quiet phone call when a court date reopened old wounds. Years have a way of softening the sharpest edges without erasing the memory. Hector is a bright, stubborn boy with his father's curiosity and something of his mother's toughness. He understands, in ways children do, that some stories have sharp bits and some have soft bits. He asked once, at 6, "Where's Daddy?" And I told him what I could, about the man who smelled like motor oil and cherry tobacco, who loved small birds and won the neighborhood's unofficial prize for the best Halloween decorations. He nodded, as if he were tucking facts into the neat drawers of his mind. The legal formalities of adoption eventually yielded a home folder fat with papers and an amended birth certificate with my name on it in a way that still makes my throat tighten. At the adoption ceremony, Father Anthony read words about family that were less religious than human and more reverent than bureaucratic. I remember the moment he signed the certificate as feeling like a completion, not of grieving, but of an agreement entered into nakedly and freely, that I would love, raise, and protect this child for as long as I drew breath. There were practical transitions, too. I had to make space in my home for childproofing, plastic plugs for outlets, cupboard locks for sharp knives that had once been proudly displayed. I relearned sleeping patterns, turned the living room into a small fort of blankets on rainy afternoons, and adjusted to the perpetual presence of a small pair of shoes by the back door. My mail changed from bank notices to library reminders. I filed tax forms with a new notation that felt like a legal seal on love. But alongside the ordinary domesticity, there always lingered the memory of that lake, the leather of the suitcase, the cold rush of water, the zipper catching like a breath. Sometimes on a bright morning I would take Hector down to the shore with Eloise at my side. We would sit on a bench and watch the lake's skin, pale as an unblinking eye, and I would tell him about the day I found him. He would listen with the solemnity only children seem to summon for their origin stories. And then, as children do, he would notice a stick floating and demand we fetch it. The world continued, insistently ordinary. People ask me sometimes how I survived those first months, how I stayed steady enough to fill forms and appointments and stand in a courtroom. The honest answer is that I wasn't steady. There were nights when I lay awake and rehearsed the worst possible permutations, and mornings when panic made my hands shake over the simplest task. But I was not alone. The community's small, mundane acts, meals, watchful neighbors, clergy, made a scaffolding sturdy enough for grief to climb upon. There were moments that felt holy and others that felt mundane. Father Anthony and I prayed in short human phrases. "Please, guard him," I'd whisper. He would answer with benign words like "Amen," and sometimes that was enough. Prayer in our life remained a quiet tool, a way to steady breath, not a promise of outcomes. Hector has grown into a child who knows about resilience in ways adults sometimes forget. He knows that families can be complicated things. He knows love wraps around imperfection and choice. We talk about justice in terms he can own, fairness, truth, and consequence. He sees the absence of his father as part of a larger story that includes both sorrow and safety. The public interest in our story has been a strange companion. Neighbors sometimes recognize me at the post office and say, "Your boy's getting big," with a kind of warmth that wants to make everything small and whole again. I have given a few interviews, always careful with names and facts, and I am mindful of the way stories can flatten people into caricatures. So I speak with restraint. I tell what happened in measured phrases, honoring the legal findings and the dignity of those involved. If you asked me now what I had found inside that suitcase beyond a fragile life, my answer would be layered. I found a boy, yes. I found a responsibility that I could not refuse. I found evidence of human smallness and also the capacity for truth to come out, however painfully, when people did their jobs. I found the unexpected generosity of a community and a determined detective who refused to let loose ends go untied. The conviction did not erase loss. It created accountability. It reminded me that in a world complex with motives and pain, systems work when people refuse to look away. I think of Carlos's confession, of how small compromises can cascade into tragedies, and of how one person's admission can be the hinge that opens a door to truth. I think, too, of the legal process and the hundreds of small acts by professionals, doctors, nurses, social workers, clerks, whose competence crafted a path out of chaos. Growing Hector has reshaped me physically. I am stronger in muscles I thought had withered. My hands have relearned to negotiate tiny buttons and stubborn laces. I have less patience for trivialities and more hunger for the small rituals that make a home: supper at 6, stories at night, a game of cards on Sundays. I have also learned to rest when my body tells me to, because the child's welfare depends on a steady caregiver, not a martyr. Once, when Hector was old enough to scribble, he made a picture and insisted I hang it on the fridge. It was a messy line drawing, probably a boat and perhaps a dog, and he stood back with a proud expression. That small, ordinary moment felt like a summation of everything that had passed: rescue giving way to routine, to the unspectacular love of daily life. There is a tenderness that has survived all of this, which I carry like a small, warm stone in my pocket. It anchors me when Grease pull grows strong. I still speak to Louis sometimes in soft phrases, telling him about the boy who carries his stubborn curiosity and his laughter. I tell Hector stories about his father as part of his own story, granting him the continuity of past and present. If my telling of these events offers anything to those who listen, I hope it is this: that love can be a stubborn force. It is not always majestic. Often it is practical, involved in forms, therapy appointments, and fumbling attempts at swaddling. It can be a legal struggle and a domestic triumph at once. It asks you to stand up again after you've been knocked down, to fill endless forms, and to practice patience with inspectors. It asks you to accept help and to fight when needed. Love, in this account, has both the quiet and the hunger of survival. We still go to the lake sometimes. I bring Hector to the same spot where the suitcase sank, a place that now carries both the memory of danger and a reminder of rescue. We scatter small crumbs of bread for the ducks and watch them paddle, single-minded and dribbling. Hector calls them quackers and throws more bread than they deserve. I sit on the bench and look at the same water that once swallowed a leather case and spit back a child into life. Sunlight slides across the surface and catches everything, forgiving and unkind. At times, people ask about forgiveness, if I forgave Cynthia, if I think about reconciliation. Forgiveness is private, and mine lives like a thread I pull at and re-knot as the years pass. I have learned there is a difference between forgiving and forgetting. The former can be an act for my own heart. The latter is not something I can give if it would erase the facts of what happened. I hold both a desire for mercy in the abstract and a recognition that some actions carry consequences that should not be lightened for the sake of comfort. Hector is growing into a kind boy. He loves to build things, blocks and card houses, and will spend a Saturday afternoon intent on a project until it collapses and he shrugs and starts again. He asks questions about the world that are unsentimental and practical. "Will Daddy come to the park?" he asks sometimes, and I answer in ways that are truthful yet protective. Not now, but we have people who love us. I think of the night I first tore the suitcase open, the smell of mud and something new and human. I think of how my life rearranged itself around a child's breath. The incident that birthed this whole story is singular and terrible, but it also created within me a fierce daily possibility to keep a small life safe and to make of grief a continuing constructive devotion. There are days when I watch Hector sleep and feel both the long span of sorrow and the sharp edge of gratitude. I feel grateful for the hands that helped carry us through, the paramedic who told me I had done right, Detective Salazar who wouldn't let the case die, Dr. Mendes who handled cold science with human care, Eloise, the nurse who taught me to be brave in practical terms, Aileen who processed me with an institutional kindness, Father Anthony, who taught me to put my head on something bigger than myself when I needed to. Small acts that assembled into a net. Life continues not because tragedies stop, but because people choose to keep making ordinary life. We put on clothes, go to grocery stores, argue about which cartoons are worth watching. We get through vaccination appointments and holiday dinners. We arrange a small memorial on Louis's birthday with a candle and a chocolate cake, the kind he liked, his face reddening when we all sang. We tell stories and laugh at the same lines he once used to make us laugh. If I had to sum up what changed everything inside that suitcase, I'd say this: I found a responsibility that remade me. I found a boy who made grief productive. I found the truth that even in the midst of unjust acts, there are people who will pursue justice, and there are knots of community that bind. Most of all, I found that love, given and received, becomes the architecture for a new life. Thank you for listening to my story. If this account moved you, please like, comment, and share. Your voice helps more real stories find the ears that need them.